So yeah, I want to talk about this idea of the YOLO in relation to the good life. But I wanted to begin by talking about a TV show I watched last summer called Beef on Netflix, which was directed by the Korean director Lee Sung-jin. And Lee Sung-jin's Beef opens with, can everyone hear me okay, by the way? Am I speaking loud enough? Yeah. Okay. So Lee Sun-jin's Beef opens with this road rage scene in suburban LA. So Amy Lau, who's in her Mercedes SUV, is tailed by the contractor Danny Cho in his beaten pickup. And the show is about these two characters who are joined together in, I guess, what you might call shared impotence or shared rage. But for me, it's Danny's brother Paul, who we're seeing in this picture taking a selfie, who captures the beef that they all have with society. So Danny and Paul live together in a cramped apartment, and Paul spends most of his time online investing. Um, Paul and Danny's parents are first generation Korean immigrants, and they followed a very traditional immigrant path in a lot of ways. So, working hard to run their motel until a cousin's drug deal runs it into the ground and forces them to return to Korea. Danny, the eldest, is still trying to make good on what a lot of people would call the American dream. So, through old fashioned graft, he's trying to grow a contracting business and he's working to build a solid reputation for himself on Yelp. But Paul has no real interest in the grind. So he shares his philosophy one day as their brothers are barbecuing by the pool. And his plan is to become a crypto millionaire and travel the world with his bros. So all he needs, he explains in the show, all he needs is three 10x trades, 1K to 10K, 10K to 100, 100 to a million. Boom. Um, so Paul has a very different sort of idea of how he's going to build himself a future. Um, it's a very different pathway to a mansion in Southern California, to early retirement, to travel, to building your parents a retirement home, to making them proud. And I feel like this other pathway to the good life was captured at this particular time. So Beef aired in the summer of 2023. This ad, Fortune Favors the Brave, aired in October 2021, with Matt Damon as the spokesperson. I might just actually play the ad. Hopefully it'll play for me. I think I played optimize.
History is filled with
Hopefully you
almosts,
should be able to hear it.
with those who almost adventured, who almost achieved, but ultimately, for them it proved to be too much. Then there are others, the ones who embrace the moment and commit. And in these moments of truth, these men and women, these mere mortals, just like you and me, as they peer over the edge, they calm their minds and steel their nerves with four simple words that have been whispered by the intrepid since the time of the Romans. Fortune favors the brave.
So you might have seen that ad on the crypto.com channels. The first use of the phrase fortune favors the brave does date from Roman times, but Damon's speech didn't age as well. The ad was removed from crypto.com channels in 2022, less than a year after the release of the ad. And had you bought Bitcoin on the day that the advertisement aired in October 2021, I mean, it changes all the time. When I was sort of researching this, I think you'd have about 400. You might have a little bit more now. Um, but Damon was the butt of various different jokes, obviously for getting behind this ad. But the message is clear here. Basically, being poor is a blight for refusing to risk it all, for refusing to dream hard enough. The ad that aired at the Super Bowl in 2022 is a little bit more circumspect. It's called The Moment of Truth. Um, and features a older, kind of more sage LeBron James, who somehow manages to travel back in time from 2023 to or from 2022 to 2003 to his 18-year-old self. Um,
All right, so cordless headphones. You can watch movies through your phone, and you don't gotta let your cars. Yeah, the future is crunk.
Anything else you want to know?
The hype too much? Am I ready?
I can't tell you everything. If you want to make history, you gotta call your own shots.
We going to the league. We going to the league. We going to the league. All right.
So LeBron James, who was another ambassador for Crypto.com, seems to be suggesting here that crypto might actually be a path to generational wealth for disenfranchised people in America, and particularly maybe for Black people. Bitcoin reared its head in the aftermath of the global financial crash in 2008. And it promised the dream of a different kind of money, as so many ordinary people lost their trust in the global financial system, along with their hopes, along with their hopes, but also, along with their homes. But in the early 2010s, the people investing in Bitcoin were still predominantly, affluent white men. But in 2021, the statistics were quite different. So advocates like LeBron were shilling the token as a pathway to generational wealth for Black Americans. Sorry, there's an ambulance going past my window here. Just let it go. So historically in America, Black Americans have struggled to build intergenerational wealth. So various different things from slavery to redlining made it impossible to hold property, to own homes, or to build and transfer wealth from generation to generation. And to this day, Black Americans still have the lowest rate of home ownership of any racial group in the United States. And those rates have only declined in recent years, only declined since the financial crash. So they've fallen as low in recent years since they were in the 1960s, when race-based forms of financial discrimination like redlining were still legal. And there's this sort of post-crash rationale that's being peddled recently that home ownership maybe isn't or can't be for everybody. So in the absence of maybe a clear pathway to the good life, crypto is being framed as a way out of financial distress. And phrases like financial inclusion and economic empowerment were being parried then by Black ambassadors. So among them, Jay-Z, Kim Kardashian, and Mike Tyson. And I think even as the phrase Bitcoin investor still might conjure up somebody from a Bret Easton Ellis novel, so like white and functionally sociopathic, the actual accounts or the statistics, such as these here, told a different story. So by 2021, Black Americans were actually more likely to hold cryptocurrency than white investors. And young people in particular, Black people, the poor and the indebted, were actually scrambling into crypto and retail trading in the hope of winning a more secure future at the height of the market. And buying in at the height of the market, a lot of them were left holding the bag. And crypto didn't level the playing field. It exposed the vulnerable to fraud and scams, and it offset risk onto the poorest in society, all while sort of paying lip service to a dream. So no shots, no leagues, and we didn't all get to make it. I got a flu last May and ended up coming back and rereading Lauren Berlant's Cruel Optimism for the first time in years, because I think this was really popular post-crash. I mean, it was published post-crash. It was published in 2010, and she was writing, about cruel optimism. So this desire that keeps people attached to something that ultimately harms them. And for Berlant, cruel optimism takes different forms, from desires for romantic love to upward mobility. So at the center of this idea of cruel optimism are dreams of something that we call the good life. And those are the fantasies that we hold on to or we recruit to make sense of the world. or the stories that we tell ourselves about how we and the world around us are supposed to add up to something. So, we see comfort in tales of that our hard work is going to be rewarded. Bullies are eventually going to get their comeuppance. That we're going to win the system. And she asks in this book, why do people stay attached to those kinds of fantasies, despite all evidence to the contrary? That that upward mobility is a thing, for example, that romantic love or marriage is redemptive, even when, we maybe know that this isn't necessarily the case. And what happens, so she's asking in this particular book, right after the financial crash, what happens when those fantasies maybe begin to fray, or when, to put it in terms that Berlant never would, shit hits the fan. Um, and the biggest story of all, the biggest kind of cruel optimism of all, is this idea of the good life. So the stories that we tell, about how our lives and the world around us are supposed to add up to something, this kind of fantasy of upward or social mobility. And that's mostly, obviously, a middle class fantasy, Berlant argues. Um, and one that, had a really strong place, obviously, in the kind of 1950s. With the sort of the sort of fantasy of the middle class home of upward mobility. Um, so Cruel Optimism was published, as I said, in 2010. So it's published in the fallout from the financial crisis, and it had this mainstream hold that's unusual for an academic text because it spoke, I guess, to this very universally felt sensibility, even though the language it's quite difficult in a lot of ways. Because that condition of feeling really precarious or feeling disillusioned spoke not only to the working class, but also to a disenchanted middle class. So feeling precarious or feeling disillusioned was something that working class people felt, but also a university educated precariat felt, that we're graduating into a recession. People who were going to university, artists who were living on the dole. So Berlant says something that, this whole sensation, it was more accurate to call this phenomenon a new global class or a way of life or an atmosphere or an existential truth, namely that there is no guarantees that the life one intends can or will be built. And I guess reading this last May, I kept sort of thinking about the pandemic and thinking about sort of what was happening right now, and particularly maybe the sorts of affect that I was seeing emerging around crypto and the pandemic. How maybe has this sort of frayed optimism or this shorn fantasy of the good life also played out in the sort of permanent crisis of the pandemic, and in particularly in the rise of crypto. So Berlant is a scholar of affect, so she's not only looking at the idea of cruel optimism and the death of the good life, but she was also looking at how that played out in particular texts or in art and literature. So she looks, for example, at a really, really interesting story called Exchange Value, which was published in the 1970s by a writer called Charles Johnson. Exchange Value was set in the 1970s on the south side of Chicago in a project. And it's about two brothers. It's not a million miles away from Beef. It's set around these two brothers who are living in a project in Chicago called Loftus and Cooter. And a bit like Paul and Danny of Beef, one of them is kind of striving very hard for upward mobility. And the other is sort of happy to sort of make do with what he has, in the sort of day to day. One of the brothers is kind of sewing up market labels into his clothes and reading a publication called Black Scholar and just trying to generally sort of better himself, while the other is daydreaming and doing nothing much. Anyway, they have this neighbor, Miss Bailey, who's kind of a bit of a horror figure in the story. So she begs for food, she eats pennies and kind of shuffles around corners. And when she stops showing up, they figure she might be dead and decide to rob her apartment. And when they break in, they assume they might find a shoebox of money or, something small like that. But instead, they find this whole stash of money from a wealthy white employer that she had years before. So it turns out Miss Bailey was a hoarder and that she's sort of frozen by this huge stash of wealth that she inherited earlier on in her life. And the brothers sort of initially recognize the money as pure potential or can do, this sort of future opening out to them. Um, and they try to spend it, but then they sort of get a bit frozen too. Johnson, or the character in the story, describes it as suffering this sort of fear of using up what little that they get in this life, believing that there isn't anything coming tomorrow. And they turn into hoarders too by the end of the story. Um, Berlant uses exchange value to illustrate how particular dreams of upward mobility and the good life are very much middle class aspirations, that for the poor there isn't any real dream of the good life. But for me, it also seemed to resonate with some of the financial nihilism of Bitcoin or the crazy holds and YOLOs of retail trading during the pandemic. So this is all a very long-winded way of me kind of saying that I started wondering, could we apply some of Berlant's ideas about the good life or affect to some of the texts that we're sort of seeing on display today? Some of the feelings that are being reflected in shows like Beef on Netflix, but also on subreddits like Wall Street Bets. On the kind of discussions that were percolating on various different Reddit channels, for example. Just as that might be felt in very kind of masculine expressions, though, like Wall Street Bets, or the trope of apes together strong, or expressions like Paul, talking about becoming a crypto billionaire and traveling the world with his bros. I also feel like it's also expressed in the kind of girl online culture of tradwives, sort of shilling financial dependence on a strong male provider, in stay-at-home girlfriends filming their daily routines, in girls asking their boyfriends for money and filming their reactions for social media, or even in the kind of Delulu videos on TikTok, where young women are speaking about potentially manifesting wealth through magic rituals or kind of ETF, or through sort of belief rather than through actual any kinds of like financial investment. So what do all of these sorts of expressions maybe add up to? As Paul and Beef and a huge outlay of advertisements for, crypto.com show us, things like retail trading obviously became very popular during the pandemic. And that's partly because some people had extra cash or extra money. It's partly because of the rise of mobile trading apps with zero fees. But also, arguably, it's because the millennials and Gen Zs in debt and with no chance of maybe financing their futures through what we might call legitimate channels, or investing in high risk and high return stocks, potentially for the chance to, win a down payment. And the hashtag for that sort of philosophy was sometimes, YOLO, as in you only live once. We probably know the etymology of YOLO. I mean, the phrase was popularized by Drake in 2011, but also by this rapper who posted that, a tweet moments before his death in a car crash. So drunk as fuck, or AF, going 120 drifting corners, fuck it, YOLO. Or in the, YOLO, or in potentially the kind of Lambos or food stamps, just sort of another, I suppose, another kind of expression of the YOLO. So YOLO means sort of going all in on one risky but potentially life-changing bet. So it's the opposite of the kind of safe and steady or incremental investment that your boomer elders might extol. So it's not concerned with diversification or risk management, because those are the kinds of safe investments that cost money that you maybe don't have. So if there's no safe or legitimate pathway to security, then why not try to win security in an all-in gamble? So it's kind of an all or nothing, in the same way Lambos or food stamps is all or nothing. So the media tended to frame it as gambling in the absence of sports or horse racing during the pandemic. But I think that doesn't really capture the desperation or the individualization of risk that crypto and meme stocks symbolized. So for many, it's more about sort of gambling for a spot in the lifeboats. So I don't know. I thought a lot about how if we think about, the super rich kind of Peter Thiel or Elon Musk solution to the future was to colonize Mars or to buy, um, build yourself a dugout in New Zealand, that the kind of pathways available then to kind of the everyday person was to sort of gamble for some kind of spot in the lifeboats. Um, so I was really interested then in the kinds of language or the sort of expressions around the future and around money on channels like Wall Street Bets, for example. Like what kind of ideas about the future, about housing, about money are expressed, on these pages. So the investors on channels like Wall Street Bets share stocks and risky trades and loss porn, but they also talk a lot about houses. So there's loads of members who are sort of waiting around for the housing market to go up in smoke so they can finally buy real estate, or waiting like Paul for those 10x trades that are going to lead to a down payment. Um, there's a lot of expressions of, this sort of desperation or copium, as it's sometimes called. And money is often described as being kind of a pathway to the future. But sometimes it's also that, money isn't quite real either. Or there's a sense that the future is somehow, irrevocably broken as well. A bit like this one here. Come back to the trash fire with the rest of us while we party through extinction. Sorry, just jump back. There's a lot of discussions, I suppose, around down payments as well, and people who are either saving or trying to like win enough for a down payment, or people who have accidentally gambled away down payments that they previously had. This is the disaster girl meme. You're probably familiar with it. So, it shows the sort of burning building, sorry, child sociopath. So the child in the image is called Zoe Roth. She's now a young adult. So Roth sold the meme of her then 4-year-old self as an NFT in 2021 for 485,000. She used the profits from the meme to pay off her student debt. So students like Roth, at the height of the NFT phrase, I guess, were YOLOing their rent money into NFTs and meme stocks, often in the hope of paying off their debts or making a down payment. And now, sadly, most of them weren't lucky enough to be internet famous like Roth is here. But in 2022, as the bubble burst, I just kept thinking kind of about the disaster girl meme, which is often kind of used in this way, and wondering if anyone would make a meme like this. So NFTs sort of crashed and burned as quickly as they soared in value. And they only ever were often sort of desperate bets on this sort of burning or like hopeless future. So a lot of my students even would have talked about sort of gambling kind of 1 month's rent, for example, in the hope of making three, or in the hope of kind of making space to make their art during kind of the height of NFT hysteria. So when everyday people were kind of gambling for a spot in the lifeboats, I suppose I was talking about this a minute ago, on a bigger level, I suppose you had these ideas from the larger kind of corporations like the Musks or the metaverses that seem to almost want to transcend or sort of leave all of the shit behind. Um, so the metaverse seemed to suggest that we could simply kind of leave all of our problems behind and almost spawn into a new reality. So if the future is irrevocably broken, that somehow you could just start over on Mars or in VR or as a brain in the upload. When you live in a shithole, there's always the metaverse is a quote from the book that actually spawned the term metaverse, but I really felt like it was sort of the underlying idea in the metaverse Super Bowl ad that first aired in 2022. Hopefully this ad will play now.
Don't you forget about me.
Closing time. Get out, please. Stop playing, please. Let's go, folks. Come on. You two over there. Let's go.
Um, Whenever I show this ad to students, like the general consensus is like how did Meta get it so wrong? Like how did they make an ad for the metaverse that looks so not fun? Um, but what I'm wondering is, maybe is this kind of very deliberate? Like whatever these companies are, they're not stupid. So it's almost as though in this case, Meta they're kind of monetizing this sort of cruel optimism. They're kind of monetizing like the end of the good life. They're capitalizing on it. There's an understanding or a sense of this sort of um copium or like desperation or end of the good life, and that is kind of quite blatant in this ad. It almost seems like we're not supposed to even think that this is a good idea or fun. um so millennials and Gen Zs like Roth and anybody really, I think, who is too young to kind of remember or be able to sort of remember the sort of fall of the Berlin Wall, were raised to be what we might call like entrepreneurs of the self. So my kind of joke, but it genuinely happened, was that I was sent at age 5 to like a fancy dress party styled as the Berlin Wall, and all the adults thought it was really funny, but I didn't understand the joke at the time. Um, but so anybody kind of born, I would say, like probably post 1984, say, was raised to be like an entrepreneur of the self, or to believe that if they simply worked or studied hard enough, success and security was waiting in your future. And so failure was often framed as some kind of personal blight for not working or grinding hard enough. Post 2008, of course, that dream is shot. So you can work and work, but that doesn't mean that you're going to have a job or security or not have roommates in your 30s. In the aftermath of the crash, a lot of middle class people, as Berlant is pointing to, obviously spoke to the death of that dream. I mean, Zizek was writing obviously about the revolt of the salaried bourgeois, and there's a lot of people writing about that idea, obviously. That sort of death of that kind of post-war ethos that if you're willing to work hard and play by the rules, that upper mobility and success were waiting in the future. But I think these generations are also a product of the very kind of speculative environment that they were raised in. Many of the day traders, for example, obviously are, they're much younger than me, so they're teenagers or children during the financial crash, or they're fledgling adults in the pandemic, so people who are just graduating college even. Or their identity, maybe was, I mentioned people kind of my age, maybe who were born between the mid 80s or the early 90s, that their identity was shaped by the vacuum of post-communist politics, or younger people who were shaped by the speculation or the excess of the dot-com era. Or younger people who were young children during the 2008 crash and kind of can remember the sort of uncertainty that their parents experienced during that time. Depending on where they grew up as well, they sort of encountered then the death of the American dream, or again, in my case, in Ireland, there's sort of the death of this sort of optimism around the Celtic Tiger. They felt the withdrawal of the state's contract and everything from mounting student debt to inferior healthcare to the rising cost of living. Um, the sort of potentially the post-war security or investment in public goods like education or housing that their parents or maybe their grandparents enjoyed to some degree has been replaced with things like volatility or risk. Um, so retail trading forums like Wall Street Bets or even NFT discords are spaces where people can trade crazy investment advice, but it can also be where they articulate their loss of hope in some of those dreams. Um, so I don't know if the tale of sort of hard work or upward mobility kept us previously sort of kept people tied into 9 to 5 jobs, possibly the fantasy of the YOLO or YOLO investment was what kept its subjects attached to the market or to risking it all. Um, and maybe, I don't know, maybe what's different today is that there's a sort of an acceleration of some of those sensations in terms of the kind of the market. Um, I don't know, just that a sense that a sense of what's sometimes called like I don't know financial nihilism. So obviously financial markets have been sort of separated from so-called real markets, you know, since the 1970s. But the kind of nihilistic vibes or desperate or hopeless vibes are something I think that really sort of characterizes these sort of new kinds of financial bets that we're seeing today. The sense that the market is kind of a giant lottery in search of the price of security. That maybe kind of in a lot of these trades, what we're getting is this sort of sense that nothing matters anymore, that hard work doesn't matter, that good sense doesn't matter, and neither do good bets or doing the right things. So there's no more dreams of the good life, no more futures. So fuck it, YOLO. I think I'm done, so I might be done a little early, but maybe that's a good thing. So I'll finish there.
Any questions, comments?
Yes, I've got one. Thanks for the talk, Rachel. And I'll put this down just in case you can't hear me. Yes, having worked in blockchain myself and been involved in some of the research and stuff, we kind of realised where this was going, and but thought we'll be positive about it first of all, but then very quickly realised that it was kind of crypto nihilism, and I just think that I've been noticing alternatives in regard to this kind of culture, but I was just wondering if you see any alternatives yourself in comparison to the suggestions that you've been putting forward today.
I mean, you know, I would definitely feel like the kind of work that Furtherfield and Ruth is behind is are some of the best alternatives. The work of Sarah Friend also. I mean, I guess so what I'm diagnosing would be like a broader like societal culture, rather than, you know, like specific.
Yeah, I was thinking more kind of like ecological alternatives, post acceleration,
Yeah.
something like that. Maybe a network version of Julian Oliver or something.
Yeah. Or do you have anyone in particular you're thinking of then?
Oh God. Well, funny enough, where I've been coming from lately is uh been getting involved with AI and trying to find ways to unpack AI so it's open source in the correct manner. But that's not with any specific groups, but we have got some stuff underway that we are working on.
Mm.
And but if anything, I myself, because I was ill for a little while with cancer, and I'm back in again. So Ruth has been more involved with the blockchain and crypto economies because I was ill.
Yeah.
But because I was ill, I just thought, fuck this. Uh, I'm much interested in nature and people, and enjoying the hacking of technology again, rather than conforming to a kind of enclosed land grab by kinds of these top-down organizations. And I just see an example of AI is very much another version of, say, iTunes, where you're locked into a system where it dictates. It's a network version of it where it dictates the behavior. What the opportunity of blockchain is, the fact is you could actually create uh, uh, new systems that break down the kind of land grab of the internet, for instance, what's happening. So you can create new cultures and systems and groups of people. But now uh, there's not enough people exploring kind of blockchain in a kind of way that's grassroots. And I would say that's the same with AI, for a few exceptions, because I did a big, massive research project on AI about 3 years ago before I got ill, with loads of people, some of them here, and uh, and that was really interesting. So I might go back to that, but I just think it's really early days that we're all discovering the societal context of the meaning of this technology rather than just the technology itself. And I just think that that the nihilism that you're proposing is really interesting, because it reminds me of the late 70s, where there was no hope, and all the governments, all the ecosystems have gone down, as in economic systems, and then punk came about and completely blew it apart momentarily. And in a sense, it kind of seemed like NFT was a kind of mini version of punk, but really it was just an illusion of it. And it had the spirit of it, but it was capitalist punk overall, but not grassroots punk. And so, in a sense, I'll be interested to see groups that are exploring a kind of punk attitude from a grassroots perspective, that can use this technology, that are not just coming from Harvard or, from a working class point of view, where the emancipation is created through the technology rather than the usual people that don't need the technology because they're rich already. That's it. I realize I'm talking too much, so I'm just going to mute
No,
myself.
no, you're not. You're not. I just, yeah, I mean, I'm just taking notes while you're talking. I think I really like what you said there about the 1970s, just that maybe this kind of point of extreme nihilism can also be a moment where something happens. I mean, I think is a very hopeful thought. Um, because I feel like I do sort of think about what's happening with young women and young men as being this like extremely kind of nihilistic moment. So
Well, I think what's interesting about the blockchain when we were first doing it, it's the similarities to the fact that you can own the medium to create your own culture. And I think the problem we've got now with, say, something like AI, is that the medium is creating you. And so what's happening is the reverse. So people can't create their own identities or culture on their own terms anymore. It's done for them through the network.
I think Adam Brown has his hand up. Has their hand
Hi
up?
there, hi there. Thank you, and thank you very much, Rachel, for the talk. And um, I've got so many books to buy now. I just want to respond to Mark's comment about punk and this kind of sense of the early optimism. I mean, I frame that as a kind of almost like an origin story of some of these things, with the DIY record labels and the way in which those kind of bands came up with this immense sense of, freedom and DIY culture. And yet, labels like Rough Trade or so on signing these bands up and creating huge fortunes from that, from an ostensibly subcultural, countercultural economy. In some senses, I think the parallels are really, really interesting to explore. I just wanted to respond to that thing about the Super Bowl ad and why that didn't hit. I was just wondering if you think that somehow it's presented entertainment, whereas now young people are consuming investment as entertainment, and whether it just completely hit the wrong marks because this is not what people expect from entertainment now. They expect almost to see narratives of investment and success as being what cheers them up. This is fun.
I mean, sorry, I actually, I'm not, I think you dropped out for a second in the middle there, but I heard you ask why did I think it not hit the mark?
Yeah,
And I mean, I don't know, because initially I was really obsessed with the comments underneath where everybody was like, like this is not it, kind of, and just everyone's response is kind of like, why the fuck would I want to go live in this metaverse where nobody has a bottom half? And, why is Facebook suggesting that I would, basically everybody who looks at this Super Bowl ads seems to understand that the message is like, if your life is so awful and you have no friends and everything is grim and bleak, then yay, like you can go to the metaverse and like, and that seems to be the message. And so I was like, but that is literally seems to be the universal takeaway. And so if it's that universal, if I show this to a group of students, every single student is like, oh yeah, so like the ad is basically about how if your life's so incredibly shit and emptied out and miserable, then you can go to the metaverse. And I realized that like if every single person you show this to, that is what they take away, then that is on point, clearly. It's not a mistake. It must be the actual
yeah,
message,
it must be the
right?
message. Yeah,
Yeah. So it must be a
it's
deliberate message. Is it? Yeah.
it's quite something.
Hmm.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, Yanis. It's really nice to see you. Helen, thank you both for, having NeMe still going strong. It's wonderful. And hopefully next time we'll do this in person, which would be very nice again. Thank you everyone for being here. And I'm just going to sort of talk a little bit about where I've been going with some thinking and research since the last book. I put a link to it in the chat, and there's also an Italian version that just came out. And I guess one of the things that I'm concerned with is we're in such a state of, kind of crisis politically and culturally, and where does the arts fit in, right? What is the role of the arts? I teach art, as Yanis pointed out, at the City University here in New York. So I have lots of students, and there's a sense in which somehow artists are very central to the discussion around politics, around these kind of various crises that we're going through. And at the same time, they're sort of impotent to do anything about it. It just doesn't seem to be sort of having any traction. And one of the things I wonder about is like, well, where does that come from? Like, where does that even notion that artists are somehow in any way responsible or even capable of intervening within the larger framework of the world, right? I think where some of us are the same era from like the 1970s. My professors early on were sort of, still coming off of the abstract expressionist period in painting, and it was very much a kind of, about a sort of formalist approach to art. I then studied with Hans Hacke and also, sort of changed my perspective on that. But I want to just kind of look at sort of where things are at maybe right now in the 21st century. So let me share my screen and do let me know if this is working. Make sure I got, yeah, here we go. So you see the power 100. If you don't, let me know. This was from just a couple of years ago, and it was kind of remarkable to see this lineup, right, of the top art influencers from Art Review magazine in Britain. When I was, going through school back in the 70s and early 80s, there was, the idea that, activist artists would be considered part of this sort of Power 100 was absolutely impossible to consider. and certainly groups that might not even be art, like Black Lives Matter or Me Too. And I'm not making a description or a clarification where they are or not, but some people would say, well, that's just a political group. But the fact that they're being put in the place of art influence is it's just sort of amazing to me, right? It's really sort of a fantastic moment in all kinds of ways. If you go over to the Tate Modern's website, you can find this kind of quiz that you can take. There's a link down below, but you can also just like Google in what art collective do you belong to? And you go to the website and they basically you answer a few questions and then some kind of algorithm comes up with a hocus pocus answer and it tells you which collective you might be part of based on your predilections and your answers. If you scroll down below the quiz part of it, you discover that there's a kind of didactic area where they have examples of artist collectives from the past. And again, this is the kind of thing that would not have been on any museum website back in the 70s or 80s. This is really a very much contemporary or 21st century phenomena. So it's sort of amazing to me to think about how this kind of more marginal art, and it certainly was marginal years ago, has become much more mainstream, quite mainstream, really. And we can look at all kinds of things. We can see examples of the way artists interact with politics here in the Black Lives Matter movement here in New York City, with this artist JR's creation of Eric Gardner, who was, murdered by New York City cops, but here his eyes return to stare at us during this, rally. Or in Venice, where our friends at Sally Docks, Marco Baravalli, and others, organize, have organized and around the idea of blocking the giant sort of ships that come into the canal, and actually have succeeded to some degree along with activists, of course, keeping that from happening, which is pretty amazing. In Belarus, where this artist, Anna Redko, she's not in Belarus because she'd be in jail if she was, but she created this image, a very famous Soviet image of a Soviet mother during the Second World War, repurposing it into the White Revolution or the White Rose Revolution in Belarus. And then some unknown artists or people or activists just projected it on a building in Minsk. Again, this would be a jailable offense. In Ireland recently, just before COVID, really, this incredible campaign to sort of make the anti-abortion laws there, which have been around for like 100 years, basically to outlaw those or to sort of strike them down. And a group of artists led this project in a really interesting way with these kind of banners, these kind of 19th century labor style banners. Or Center for Political Beauty in Berlin, who went out into the countryside where a really far right politician has his home. And under a tarp, they recreated the monument to the murdered Jews of Europe, which is in Berlin, as you know. And they made a miniature version of it. And then they just kind of pulled the tarp off. And this guy looks out of his window and suddenly he sees it. Well, why did they do that? Because he said something to the effect, this is Bjorn Hulk, that it's like Germany's notorious, Germany is the only country that would put its own shame in the center of the capital. In other words, a very, very anti-Semitic kind of remark. Amazing sort of project, Center for Political Beauty. Ukrainian artists, diverting their sort of welding techniques and casting techniques to produce anti-tank weapons. All kinds of ways that artists have been engaging with the sort of social, with the political. Dred Scott's slave rebellion reenactment. It's a very famous slave uprising. It's actually famous now partly because of him. Wasn't as well known, but it was the largest slave uprising in the United States. And this would have been in 1810, around 1810, 1811, around Louisiana. And he actually just outfitted people with costumes from that period and had them march through the streets, the same area, which would have been sugar plantations, of course. Now it's called Cancer Alley. The reason for that, of course, as you probably know, is these, these fertilizer, I mean, not fertilizer, actually petrochemical, it might also be fertilizer, petrochemical plants in the background. And it's a mostly Black and community or brown community, and the cancer rate is sort of off the charts there. So you get this kind of disjunction in time with his project. And I don't have time to get into all these projects in depth, but I wanted to just give a quick overview. And maybe much more recently, an illegal guerrilla-style banner drop inside the Guggenheim Museum, which is going to appear a few times in my talk, of the artist Asif, who did these kind of photographs or photo montages of women grieving their children in Gaza, right? And these were dropped inside the museum just a few months ago. I guess the question is, though, in a time of crisis, in a time like ours, is there really a time for art, right? I mean, you feel like your head's going to explode. How do we deal with all these issues that are going on? Climate crisis, the situation in Gaza, it goes on and on. Is there a time for art? And I think back to Doa Ali, who is actually a theater person, but this was something that she wrote during the Tahrir Square uprising, 2011. After a devastating bombing or a political victory, there's no time for art. That is to say, no time for contemplative reflection, for philosophy. Now, it's interesting to think those are the things we associate with art, right? Reflection and philosophy. She goes on to say it is time for action, solidarity, or celebration, and anything else seems inappropriate. What's happening now is bigger than art's limited ability to grasp and address it. I mean, we could have a lot of different feelings about this sentiment, but it certainly is something that everyone has to sort of think about at certain moments. Do you drop your art practice and go stand on the barricades, right? Even think back to the Paris Commune. Around the time of Tahrir Square, I went down to Wall Street, and of course there was the Occupy Wall Street going on, and this person was carrying around, like the very beginning of the action, Wall Street is destroying America, the 1%. But of course, what did he use to illustrate the piece? And of course, it's a Damien Hirst titanium skull worth, millions and millions of dollars. So the association between the 1% and the sort of what Wall Street is doing and the high art world, right? The global art world, which is maybe hovering around $60 billion worth of value, was being made very much in a strong connection here at Occupy Wall Street. And I think it comes into a lot of people's heads when they think about art. So how do you account for this? On the one hand, you have sort of this art that defends the idea of social and political concerns and gets involved. On the other hand, it seems like art is doing something completely the opposite. Just quick quote from Martha Rosler, just to put this in our sort of floated out there in your head. The artist's imagination continues to dream of historical agency. There are a lot of ways to interpret what she said, and I've never really asked her specifically what it is. Maybe one of these days when I get a chance, I'll do that. But I like to think part of it has to do with the very long history of art in relationship to politics in the modern sense, right? So we're going now back to the period just after the French Revolution, when there was the restoration of the monarchy. And a lot of people were reflecting on, like, what happened? What was that revolution about? Thinking about it in relationship to society. Among those was Henri de Saint-Simon, who was, a socialist, early sort of quasi-socialist sort of philosopher, religious socialism, of that particular period. And before he died, either he or one of his very close followers came up with a tract in which he talked about the idea that there should be three elements to the sort of perfect society. Maybe we could even call it a utopian society. There would be engineers. There would be sort of the people who actually had the sort of capital to sort of produce things. Let's call it the sort of, the business class. And then there would be artists. And it would be the artists who would give the sort of vision to what that society is. It is we artists who shall be your avant-garde, picking up the term avant-garde from the period of the French Revolution, when it was really meant as a kind of military term to defend, the revolution against backsliding into aristocracy, which it did, of course. So this is 1825. Obviously, the term avant-garde goes through a lot of changes. I'm not really interested in that long, complicated story around, is there an avant-garde? What is the avant-garde? But here, the notion that artists should be sort of the tip of the spear of social change, right? They're the ones who create the vision. It seems to me this is one of those places where Martha's maybe point is really sort of pivoting. But it's very interesting to think about that moment. 1857, around this period of time, the French colonize Algiers. They take it over, and interestingly enough, it's Saint-Simon's followers who actually go there in numbers and try to create a kind of utopian society in Algiers. What's really amazing, of course, is that how badly that worked out, right? People were soon reduced to poverty. The French engaged in all kinds of brutality against the Algerian people, and needless to say, it was not a successful utopian experience. So you have to then put that into the pot, like, okay, we are the tip of the spear, but then exactly what kind of a spear, what kind of javelin, what kind of arrow is being sort of shot or thrown here, right? If we're the avant-garde and it's our vision, then what kind of vision, or is it just very complicated? Is it very contradictory and paradoxical? I want to give you a quick case study, my own experience in New York City in the 1980s. This is literally like down the street from where I lived on 7th Street on the Lower East Side. And it was a neighborhood mostly made up of immigrants that had been really built out of landfill for the most part in the late 19th century, with tenement buildings, classic tenement buildings where workers lived. I got involved right after graduating from school with a group of people, Lucy Lepard, among others, in a group called Political Art Documentation Distribution. This is a newsletter we put out. We were not a group that had any funding. We self-organized and produced way too many things and burned out within about 10 years, including an important archive, though, which is at the Museum of Modern Art of all places. The neighborhood that I was living in was also known as Loisaida by the local Latinx residents, mostly Puerto Rican, some Dominican. But at the same time, the government had, the city government had basically introduced private funding in order to sort of bail the city out, because in the mid-70s, New York City went bankrupt. I mean, it was kind of unbelievable. The biggest city in the United States goes bankrupt. And the president, famously, at that time it was Gerald Ford, who had taken over from Nixon, who had, of course, resigned in disgrace, said, we're not going to bail out New York City. So this was the beginning of the neoliberalization, really, of the United States, or one of the important beginnings for it, having private sources, bail the city out. And then, of course, the government comes in afterwards. But that move really, really shaped what happens in New York City from this point on, to the point where we have, I would say hyper gentrification. I don't even know, there's got to be another word for it at this point, because of what really started here in the mid-70s into the early 80s. Simultaneous with this, there was also a new art movement happening, or new art exhibition spaces happening in that same area. Because the spaces were so inexpensive, you could open a little art gallery, and the art scene was moving away from the kind of minimalism and conceptualism that had dominated when I was a student, to a painterly, crafts-oriented, figurative kind of artwork, a lot of things with cartoons and graffiti. But the people that I worked with, who were more, let's say, politically minded, and nevertheless also gentrifiers in our own way. I'm not trying to, whitewash what we were. Worked with a community organization, in this case, a New Rican organization, El Bohio, which had been given a public school. So again, the population in the city had dropped so much, there were schools that were just empty. So the city would give, like, for a very low amount of money, or even for free, a school for community groups to take over and turn into spaces. And This space was called El Bohio. It's right around the corner from where I lived. We created an exhibition to try to get people aware of the gentrification going on. And you see on the right, this is actually the real logo of New York City with some modifications. The story is, of course, Peter Stuyvesant, the Dutch entrepreneur, bought Manhattan for like $20 and a wristwatch or a pocket watch from the Lenape people. Here, the Lenape person is like rejecting the money. Okay, we don't want this, you know. And we had all kinds of posters. There was no internet. We put posters up in the streets and cafes. You know, let's be part of a big exhibition, and you know, we will show that we're against gentrification in the neighborhood. Street stencils, of course, here based on scene from Guernica. And we opened this exhibition in 1983 with hundreds of artists, and the New York Times decided to review it, and it was, you know, it was reviewed under this title, Pioneering in New Territories. And we're like, what the fuck? This is exactly what we were trying to sort of oppose, right? We're not the pioneers in new territories. Well, you know, in fact, we really were, but this was not really what we wanted to be doing. How did we fuck up so bad, right? That was the question we had. So we decided the next year to take another approach, which was to directly talk about the artist's role in the neighborhood. And we created an exhibition called Out of Place, Art for the Evicted. We even created 4 art galleries, because remember, there were art galleries popping up all over this neighborhood, which was always had been very working class, poor, Puerto Rican, Chinese, all kinds of mix of people. And they were being displaced by this process. So we had Leona Helmsley, who was really basically her and her husband, like the Donald Trumps of that period. She actually went to prison for tax evasion, which hopefully we will see the same result in this country, but maybe he'll be president from prison. God knows what's going to happen. Another gallery done in graph style, because graffiti art became part of the art world during this period. Discount Salon, and then Guggenheim Downtown, which there was no Guggenheim Downtown at the time. This was our theorization of what was going to happen, that these little galleries would sort of soften up the neighborhood, and then the big art world would move in, which is more or less exactly what did happen. Some of the works by Edgar Heap of Birds, Native American artists in the street. Oh, I didn't tell you. Okay. Yeah, we created 4 galleries, but these galleries were in the street. They were actually not spaces. We literally named 4 street corner locations, galleries that were places where people would put up posters for music and whatever, and we just took it over and made them into art projects. And we kept putting these posters up because they would get covered over, they would get, you know, halfway torn down. Trickle down art gallery scene. It's a very funny project by the late Ed Eisenberg. This was the opening at the Guggenheim Downtown. You can sort of see we spray painted that at the top of the wall. And people were doing sort of voter registration drives here and other kinds of ways to get people in the community also more involved politically. But we really tried to point the finger at the art world. That's 1984. Years later, I'm working at New Museum as the curator of education, worked on an exhibition called Urban Encounters, and one part of the exhibition brought this pad work in to sort of show people like the time lapse, right, more than 10 years. And you can sort of see that the gallery, if you look at the top, is now on the left is the gallery when we did the art show in 84. And on the right in 98, you can see it's become sort of a, you know, a hipster cafe. Classic kind of move in this process of gentrification. Art Forum covered the East Village scene in a special issue. This is, I think, 1999, the next year. And in that entire issue, the project that we did only had this one little tiny representation, the same photograph I showed you before. Like, this was the only thing saying, well, there were also some artists who were like opposed to what was going on in the neighborhood. That's it. And the only result that you can think about is we failed. You know, we really failed. We failed, of course, to stop gentrification. We failed to make the link between art and art culture and displacement anything more than just a discursive term. In fact, it got a lot more play in academia than it ever did really politically or in any way that really actually changed anything. So today, you just Google the word art, social engagement, art and politics, whatever, social practice art, and you come up with all kinds of immediate sort of hits. And as Giannis pointed out, I actually direct a project at the CUNY Graduate Center, which is funded by the Mellon Foundation, where we, bring in graduate students and have them work around the idea of art as a form of social justice, or art in league with social justice objectives. So it's become really kind of mainstream almost, this whole idea of socially engaged art. And yet, if we really look closely at sort of the reality of things, we see at a superficial level, there's a lot more visual diversity in the art world. Women have a much bigger, sort of appearance in the art world. People of color have a much bigger appearance than they did when 1970s, 1980s. And yet, here's the auction results worldwide, and you still see that it's white male artists who are not just a little bit ahead of everybody else, but far ahead of women artists in the purple, Black American artists in sort of the red, and then the pink at the bottom, Black women American artists. Just a reality check. Exhibitions, you see the same kind of patterns going on. Exhibitions and acquisitions, exhibitions obviously at museums, and then acquisitions by museums, and you can pretty much see the same tendency. So what's happening here? Is all these kind of like moments of sort of change, are they just on the surface, right? What about the political economy of the art world? Is anybody really tackling that? Is that deep structure being affected? Stepping back even further, let's look at the fact that over the period of time we're talking about, let's like situate yourself about halfway through 1977. That's actually the year I arrived in New York City from Philadelphia. And you can see like wages for working class wages are dropping, right? They're dropping, continued to drop since then with a bit of an uptick recently. And then corporate capital and profits up and up and up. This is based, of course, in the US, but I would suspect you would see similar things in other parts of the world. And you can even sort of look at this strange way that the finances, this is equitable growth, going back into the 1920s, really, right? The height, just around the time of the Great Depression, maybe 1930, right? You sort of could imagine this as a graph about the sort of the story of art, modern art being incredibly sort of powerful and wealthy and doing very well. And again, now in the present, doing very well, but not in relationship to working class, let's say, wealth, but in relationship to global wealth by that upper class, by that 1%, 0.01%. And just to add to the misery, some of you may know Gulf Labor Coalition that I was part of. I'm technically still part of it. We're not really active. We worked very hard to try to stop the Guggenheim from building a new museum on Saadiyat Island in Abu Dhabi, because they were building it with migrant workers who were being treated, abominably. And I can get into that if you'd like to in the Q&A. But this was the vision, right? You can see on the side the sort of flying saucer thing. That's the Louvre Museum, and then this structure that looks like cones and squares and rectangles is a Frank Gehry Guggenheim, enormous Guggenheim. We protested. We went into the museum in New York City with guerrilla actions such as this one. We did actions in Venice at the Guggenheim there. And for a while, the museum just was on hold. But someone was in Abu Dhabi just a few weeks ago, Andrew Ross, and took this picture. And the museum is now well underway, despite everything else. So what's happening? Let's go back for a second to this roster of groups on the Tate, and let's think about this. We have these groups. They're not all radical art groups, but they claim they're radical here. But they were all collectives, and some of them were fairly political. Some of them were explicitly political. there's groups like the Black Audio Collective and Hackney Flashers, who are a feminist group in London, Guerrilla Girls. You can see what's interesting and disturbing is that when they created this website, this was when right around the time of the beginning of the pandemic, and the museum, Tate Museum as a whole, was trying to get rid of like 100 workers. And of course, they were all, low down staff. They weren't sort of the management level, right? They certainly weren't the curators. And so people went on strike outside the museum. So while they're talking about what art collective do you belong to, and you should know about your radical art collectives of the past, here you have an action taking place against the museum. And one can imagine that if these art collectives were still around today somehow, they would just abandon this website, march off it until it was empty. So I guess the question comes back to, is this a time for art? Perhaps this deeper question of the political economy has to be addressed at the level of labor, and where is labor play, what role labor plays in the arts economy and the cultural economy, but also more broadly at this moment. And so beginning to try to think about that link, because it's sort of been missing. We know that there's been a rather remarkable museum union movement going across the United States. It's a beginning of something, perhaps. Other kinds of unions have begun to sort of spring up again in the United States. It's still a pittance of what it was back in the 1950s, 40s, 30s, but something is stirring. And I guess the question I want to sort of end with is it possible to begin to think again about the way we might be looking at organizing around issues of labor and political power in order to make a change? And I'll just end with this one little note that, along with a couple of other people, I'm beginning to work on a new journal called Left Art Review. It hasn't been launched yet. This is a kind of preview of the website, leftartreview.org. And I can put the call for papers in chat, but this will be probably by the next month. Hopefully, we will actually have this up and running. And we're specifically asking these kind of questions. If we are the tip of the spear, if we go back to Saint-Simon, we are the tip of the spear. Well, exactly what kind of spear are we the tip of? Like, whose spear is it and where is it going? Okay. So that's my little talk, and I am open for questions.
Coming from pirate radio street art kind of history myself in Bristol with people like Heath Bunting, where we used to do lots of stuff. It's very similar to some of the stuff you've shown in some of your earlier ventures. And I think we come from a very similar but different place, but there are similarities. And from my experience regarding a kind of institutional narrative of radical art, is that as soon as it's represented, it kind of gets dumbed down into a kind of shallow product. And in a sense, what I keep learning myself each time, even though we managed to become a NPO in London, because they believe that because we work in technology that we're entrepreneurs, when we're really not. We show radical art in the space and then the park and everything, but because they're not looking, we've got around it somehow. So don't show this on the internet. Oh no, sorry. Anyway, so the thing is that a lot of the people I think that we work with, including the artists and also everyday people from different cultures, is that there's not a zeitgeist that is hegemonic that can work for any of us. Is the only zeitgeist or anything that can work for us now is not like a big system like communism, those kind of things. It's much more something that is temporary, and then it moves on to something else, and it's more of a journey than somewhere where you can just settle down into one arrow, for instance. I just think that it's very much, that I don't feel like, for instance, drum and bass in the 90s in London was very much a kind of grassroots but very artistic music that had its own voice, but it didn't last long, but it moved on to something else. So I just think that as long as people like your good self is about and ourselves here, we are the people that will be keeping this story alive. And but I don't think we can for 1 second believe that anyone else is going to be bothered to do that if they had no investments to do it. And I just think that's part of the problem.
Yeah, I think what you're putting your finger on exactly the issues. We went through the period in the late 90s to early 2000s of tactical media and sort of, the concept that instead of trying to occupy space, let's say like a traditional party or left opposition would do, we would, in a very sort of Michel Desserteau kind of way, we would like do something, we would change, we would take another space, we wouldn't hold space, right? We would be horizontal, we'd be nimble, we'd be able to slip in the back door, do something, slip out the back door. Think of the yes men as a great example. They keep changing their names every time you turn around, right? Except the question comes back, like, why are we failing so badly? We, meaning a kind of left, let's say, however broadly you want to put it, something seems to be out of joint, right? We started moving in these horizontal ways, this kind of ultra horizontality, and we actually resemble a lot of ways to the far right, which also absolutely despises the notion of the state, right? Down with the state, drain the swamp, is Trump's great slogan, right? So it just seems like maybe we have to rethink the question of actually attaining power. Foucault made that a dirty word. But maybe it's time to start thinking about, well, what would it mean if we actually did go towards power and try to sort of make real change on a broader scale? What would that require? What kind of organization would that require? And maybe this kind of endless tactical horizontality isn't the answer.
No, but maybe a part of the answer is to have, I mean, like, uh, if you look at some of the kind of organizational infrastructures that are kind of challenging patriarchal and typical hierarchical hegemony and hypercapitalism, etc., there's a few groups doing that. I'd say NeMe is doing that, Third Field's doing that, Xioma's doing that, and some other groups. I'm not too familiar with some of them in American, which you'll know, but I just think, and there's other groups I can mention that are in Spain, and I just think, but the problem is most of them aren't connecting up together to build a solid network where they can say publish or demonstrate a kind of power which you propose, where they don't work. They're always in competition with each other because obviously they've got their own issues around funding and survival. And I just think that one of the good things, say, for instance, about the internet, as we all know, is that we can collectively build a support structure where people can invest in it to build something that reflects something like what you're proposing, and rather than just relying on some kind of organization that really doesn't care about any of the values of what's being discussed.
I'm just thinking though, we've had the internet for like what, 30 some years, like in its present form, one way or another. And we've been able to do a lot of interesting things connecting with each other. And since COVID, obviously the Zoom thing has become very prominent. And yet it doesn't feel like we've actually made any really significant movement towards this construction of some larger thing. I also don't know if affecting academia, by writing more papers and all these sort of things is actually where we need to be putting our energy. We need to be really thinking in terms of mobilizing people beyond the art world and in ways that are really sort of like to oriented towards like would it take to actually make real significant social change. Just having a kind of lifestyle that sort of says, hey, I'm cool, I'm different, I'm look at I'm part of this sort of movement, whatever. That's clearly not sufficient because it isn't working. That's for sure. And look at the art world. I mean, just what's amazing to me too. I mean, I didn't put this in the PowerPoint. Is like just in the last few months, right? The art world constantly talks about how sort of broad it is and how sort of multicultural it is, and which it's like really trying to show how much work it's done in that direction. But the moment somebody opens their mouth about defending the Palestinian people, you find out how short the chain is, right? You're out, like you lose your job at Art Forum, you're out of your curatorial position. The entire search committee for Documenta 16 resigns over like something. It's sort of incredible to see like actually when you get to the real meat of the matter, how quickly you discover you really are sort of a kept creature.
Yes, we've recently been challenged by the Arts Council for our political stance on various things, including what's happening in Gaza. And you realise that most of these structures that are ruling the kinds of cultural consciousness are actually just paying lip service to these values that people desire that actually don't become real. And yeah, so it's difficult. It's difficult.
Yeah. How do you get beyond just shaking your fist, right? Like,
yeah.
What's the next step? I think that's kind of what I'm asking. Thanks, Mark. That's interesting. It's good.
We're South Africa, Southern Africa, India, Brazil, and so on, where we're working. We're asking similar questions. What went wrong? And we're not pessimistic, though, because there's a lot of energy.
Yes.
But it is being deflected, fragmented, and it's a long discussion. I don't want to in any way kind of make speeches now. It's a longer conversation. But there is hope, and there are initiatives, and yes, South Africa is in a big strain with the West at the moment, and Europe. We disagree fundamentally on most issues. And yet the energy is there, the creativity is there. Our best people are being bought. The establishment is winning, and yet there is resistance. There's lots of networks. There are a lot of a decolonial movement that is gaining ground, connections between the oceanic communities of not the Atlantic now, but the so-called Indian Ocean or the Afro-Asian seas. There's a lot of activity happening, but it needs a new international of the imagination, I think. And we appreciate what you're doing there in New York, an incredible kind of resilience despite all the nonsense that has happened. So thank you, the contribution. I don't want it to become a dialogue now of somebody marginal to the conversation taking over.
Thank you, Ari.
Thank you.
I think and I think this question of being deflected or absorbed, is really, we've always had to deal with the idea that you're going to have your work institutionalized at some point, right? You're going to have to end up being an NGO. You can't just keep operating as a collective. You're going to have your work in the museum. This is a pattern, but it feels like what we're witnessing for a long time now under neoliberalism, which may itself be endangered. Of course, it is endangered, no question about it. Was the idea that this creativity has to be part of the system, right? I'm sure you've read the book by Boltanski and Chiapello, The New Spirit of Capitalism. It's worth sort of dusting off and just remembering like this idea that capitalism shifts itself to sort of absorb the sort of artistic critique, right? And then it operates with that artistic critique in a very successful way. So it's almost like the more creative we get and the more resistance we try to show through our creativity, the better the system seems to operate. That's the difficult part that we're at, And how do you sort of diffuse that? Like, or how do you short circuit that? Or how do you get around that? That's the question.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. But also there's two patterns there, and I will shut up. The one is that you're dealing with incredible talent that needs to realize itself. It cannot always be the jukebox of the revolution or the trade union or the actual immediate struggle. They need to kind of be creative in the fullest sense. So you need the conditions for that to happen. You can't have somebody who has studied in 5 generations of playing the sarangi in India and tell them to just play 3 notes for me to sing my resistance song. So it's at all kinds of levels that we need to be thinking at the moment.
No, I agree with you. I mean, we saw what happened here with the American Communist Party, and just sort of taking someone like Paul Robeson, a kind of incredible artist, really, but kind of reducing him to like a cipher for, their ideas. So I totally agree with that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Not an easy position to talk about practical artistic work with like the discussion we've been having. But we'll try to take you through some of our works and maybe start off quickly. I'm gonna try to share the screen. Let me see here. Can you see our screen now?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. So this is kind of the next thing we're going to be doing is a curatorial project with Axioma Space in Slovenia, which has already been mentioned a few times, around Unreal Data, real effects. And this is happening over the next 3 months. And I'm mentioning it because it kind of is that I kind of feel that we as artists, we've been, for the last 15 years, concerned with technologies and the question of how do we gain agency when faced with usually systems or technologies that are much larger than we are, where we are like small players. And the question is always, how do we find a space for either to intervene, but also to, I think, maybe it is about this question of the good life. How do we kind of bring to this very deterministic way of looking at technology that we're confronted with, that comes out of Silicon Valley, a different approach where we kind of take the stand for technologies that connect us, that open up spaces for discussion, that are less data-driven, that allow for, I don't know, real connection. And this is something we've been kind of looking at in different iterations for the last 15 years. It's interesting to do that, at least in our view, also, not only because society has been changing so much, or our societies have been changing so much, also the art worlds we're all part of have been changing a lot, but also the technologies have been changing a lot. So we've been trying to apply, I'd say, sometimes punk, sometimes Dadaistic approaches to these spaces and kind of gain from them at least a certain sense of autonomy, maybe for ourselves or for people who participate. Just a quick 2-3 sentences about Unreal Data, real effects. I think with this curatorial project, we've been trying to focus on the way that in data-driven societies, data no longer just represents an event or a measurement or represents something in the past, but is actually affecting our contemporary and our futures, in that data is really creating world. I think the work you can hopefully see on the screen by Simon Weckert kind of illustrates that really well. Simon Weckert is a Berlin-based artist, and he'll be doing the first show in a series of 3 at Axioma. He did a work in 2020. This was a performance he actually did here in Berlin in 2020. He took 99 smartphones for a walk. You can see them on the image in the little red cart along a street in Berlin, with the aim of these smartphones all connected to Google Maps, then kind of producing the data on Google's side to signify traffic jam. So his idea was, if I walk slowly with carrying 99 phones, which nobody ever does, of course, along a street, will Google Maps reroute traffic around the street I'm kind of occupying on my own? And this is we think a very clever approach to data, not trying to look at what data represents, but what it can actually signify to the data gathering technology. And in this case, of course, usually when phones move slowly together along a street, this means it's that amount of cars, or maybe half that amount of cars. Of course, this work, as we've already heard and talked about, it's short-lived, in that, of course, Google Maps then also learns from these temporary hacks or inserts into their technology, and they try to filter out these noises and try to be more precise in predicting where traffic jams are. But I think for us, it's much more about a way of seeing or looking at systems when we're looking from below and trying to figure out what the system sees, or in terms of how we can kind of use that knowledge to create spaces that can be important to us. Or
I mean, the beauty about this work is, of course, that, it produces this empty street, like this idea that you can kind of like walk on your own. And the second thing is also kind of like, that you see that, I start to ask the question, did we ever agree that Google routes our traffic in Berlin? I mean, like, whoever decided on that? And, he kind of like cleverly opens up this discourse of kind of like who is having agency in which moments. And I think it's very inspirational for that thing. And kind of like the term of unreal data comes out of this idea that, that you have algorithmic regimes around, and the idea is if you falsify the inputs, if you give kind of like false data into this kind of like algorithmic regimes, can you produce new sorts of reality also? And one other example, which maybe we can talk briefly about, kind of like this Chinese kids during the pandemic were forced to install like a surveillance app on their phones for remote learning, for e-schooling. And they knew kind of like that, it's going to track them. The microphone is on, the camera is kind of like accessible for the government. And they tried to fight it. So what they did in the end is kind of like they formed some sort of like crowd protest, organized themselves online, brought together several 10,000s of people, and all at the same time went to the kind of like app stores, Baidu, Weibo, Google, and Apple stores, and downrated the app to 1 star, which means kind of like that this app is being kicked out of the stores because also there are kind of like algorithmically curated and have like these rules. And the company then had kind of like real problems, like who wrote the software, the DingTalk software, had real problems to reach anybody because kind of like these companies can't be reached by email or by phone. So they created this space of kind of like, of understanding how these things work to be able to kind of like express themselves, which we found very clever and a very interesting way of kind of like looking at things.
Okay, I'll quickly, we can. Okay. So we're sharing the screen again. I'm not sure. It's always hard to talk about this work, even though it's one of the pieces we at least feel kind of shows very well what we mean about with kind of creating the technologies we want. So maybe we'll talk about it anyway. What do you think? Oh, no, we
Please
can't.
do, because there are some people who don't know about it here.
Okay. One moment. I'm trying to enter full screen. Is that better now? Yeah, maybe. So opera calling is actually one of our first works and always a bit difficult to explain 15 years later because technologies have changed so much. So we actually grew up in Switzerland, both of us in Zurich, and Zurich is a very small town. But it is the biggest town in Switzerland. In Switzerland, culture is very often, at least the bigger institutions are state funded mostly. And Zurich is very proud of its opera house. For a town or a city that small, the opera house has quite a bit of relevance in the opera world. So it's kind of on a level with the Milan Opera or the Vienna Opera, and is really, really well funded and has been really well funded for many, many decades. And for us as young artists in Zurich, working with the internet, which for us in a first instance, so we started out in the mid 2000s, the internet for us was a very liberating space. And this, of course, also has changed in the past years. But at the time, as younger artists, the internet for us meant being able to publish work without going through gatekeepers like galleries or museum curators. So we kind of formed groups of artists and just did stuff on the internet and published stuff on the internet, used the internet as our material. And we became really fascinated at the time with the Zurich Opera House, because the Opera House was very much, it felt like the total opposite of the internet. So it was like, very closed. You had, the tickets were very expensive. You had to wear certain clothes, know about certain stuff to find entry into the opera house. And they, at least in the case of the Zurich Opera House at the time, they did not play any contemporary opera. So only, people who were long dead and usually male. I think always male probably is not a stretch. And we were invited by the Gabriel Voltaire, a young institution in Zurich at the time, at the birthplace of Dada. Dada being the art movement of the early or late 10s, early 20s in Zurich, formed by displaced artists from all over Europe who fled the First World War and kind of gathered in neutral Switzerland in Zurich and formed the Dada movement. The Dada movement was, as you know, very much about not wanting to speak the language that had led to this war. So they experimented a lot with cut-up techniques. And through a number of really nice coincidences, an institution today is at the birthplace of Dada, dedicated to keeping the Dada spirit alive, but they also do a lot of contemporary art. Or they fund new contemporary works. And they asked us to do they called it a neo-Dada work, which for us was a bit absurd at the time. But anyway, we were interested in this opera house, and we kind of thought, well, can't we kind of use technology to open up this house to the new century at least, or kind of get it some more connectivity. And something we always like to do is look at how technologies were used immediately after they are invented. And this illustrates the case of the telephone, which is really interesting because the telephone was pretty much from its invention in the mid-1800s, commercially used. And at the time, what they did was they would, because you couldn't tell people where, get a phone and then maybe somebody else will get a phone in the same town and you can call them. They used it actually as more like a radio. Radio, of course, wasn't invented yet, and they hooked up any cultural institutions. Basically, they had any cultural institutions producing an audio feed to the telephone network and sold the telephone as a kind of a remote listening box to people's to subscribers. And you can see this on the left. It's kind of illustrated the telephone doesn't have the personal receiver we saw then later. It's more like a gramophone put onto the wall. And on your right, you have the opera singer or the theatre performance going on with microphones below the actress being rebroadcast to people's homes. And we basically thought, well, wouldn't it be nice to kind of redo this like 100 years later? But we don't ask for permission. We just kind of reinstate the service and we bring it to people, to their homes. This is, of course, still in a time of landlines. And we bring it to the people randomly chosen from the Zurich telephone book, because they're actually the people paying for this opera with their taxes.
Yeah, so the idea was basically to book the opera house at the right, then have an exhibition space at the Cabaret Voltaire, where we would have like this telephone machine, which would get the connection from the opera house and then rebroadcast that to the telephone network, just like by randomly dialing.
Okay.
Sorry.
Sorry, somehow I'm not getting.
So at the beginning, we started to play around with kind of like pirate radio systems, trying to kind of like get the data, the audio stream out of the opera house, and then started to play kind of like with microcomputers and stuff like that, and like fastly realized that we are basically rebuilding something which is already existing and which is there in forms of a phone. So we found this nice phone, which is a Nokia 3210. They were kind of like being sold on eBay for around $10. And these phones have like had this beautiful function that you could call them, and they have an auto pickup function. So The idea was to drop those phones all over the opera place and then call them from the Cabaret Voltaire. They would auto pick up and then rebroadcast the opera to us. We extended the bug basically with a battery with a microphone. So it would kind of like we would have a bit of a better audio quality because kind of like phone microphones are made for transmission of speech, not so much music. And we just like taped the phone quickly. So whenever we would call it, it would be muted, but the LED would not, kind of like the LED screen would not light up. So we just like quickly taped it and then kind of like, put them all over the opera house. This is an image of the Zurich Opera. Of course, it's kind of difficult to hide stuff in the public seating area. So we took part in tours. We learned about kind of like backstage and would hide them kind of like mostly like backstage and in this lightning kind of like booths. This happens mostly during public tours. So we took part in a lot of public tours, would sneak off and kind of like hook up our phones to the electric system. So 3 days after the kind of like the exhibition opening, some journalists started to call the opera house, asking them if they know that they are bugged, basically. And the opera house was, of course, not very happy about the loss of control of their audio space and started a big search about these bugs. And so this is kind of like an image you see from TV news where the opera house was super surprised that these bugs were mobile phones because they thought they are dealing with some James Bond devices.
Yeah, go on. Oh, and and they sent us a pretty harsh letter stating that if we did not debug the opera house within, I can't remember, 2 days, they would send in the Swiss military to find all the bugs, which was actually very hilarious because when we placed these bugs, our phones, of course, were not the only phones laying around in backstage areas. There were like a lot of people charging their telephones everywhere. So anyway, and this is an image of how the audio space looked in the exhibition space. And so this was actually the only place you could listen in on the ongoing performance of opera calling if you didn't stay at home and just waited for the phone to ring, which was what we told people to do. Don't come to the exhibition space, just
stay at home, kind of like we'll reach you. And the opera tried to kind of like, they said that they would sue us for basically two things. One is that we need to remove these bugs. The other one, of course, was copyright infringement. Because we didn't pay for retransmission rights of their audio stream. And the third one even was they wanted to sue us for libel, which meant this was coming from the musicians association, basically, which was very unhappy about the audio quality of the live stream, of the live broadcast, saying the quality is too bad. So people could think that they kind of like the music is bad or they are bad musicians. And after a while, like in big, this was kind of like all public. The media was writing about it every day. Kind of like it became this sort of a news story. we said we won't stop till they find all the bugs. So this rumor about how many bugs are there was out. To one journalist would say there's 3 bugs, to the other one we would say there's 5, there's 10, there's 100. So just like keep it a bit in this dadaistic kind of like open space while still rebroadcasting every opera 3 times a day.
Yeah. And I think this work fell into a time where there was a very intense discussion going on in academia around publicly funded research and who should have access to this. And this work kind of led to a similar discussion within kind of the local or the Swiss publicly funded art scenes. This question of accessibility, who gets to go, who gets, who has
access to culture,
the ability even, just to kind of go to these or take part in these performances in these institutions. And it's also led, which we of course don't know if that is related directly, but it has led since Opera Calling, the Zurich Opera in summer rebroadcasts most of their performances to the square in front of the house on a big screen where you can just, take a chair and listen in, which of course is not the same, but it kind of, I do think it kind of made them think about their relationship with the city or kind of with kind of their contemporary context in a way.
Should we show the video quickly?
Should we? Yeah, let's move on, maybe. Okay. I think the second work we would really like to quickly talk to you about is has to do with today being a decisive day for WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange, who is in court or court is in session today in London to decide whether he can appeal the extradition request from the US. And we have a kind of, we did a work that brought us into a relationship with WikiLeaks, with Julian Assange already 10 years ago. Yeah, 2013, 11 years ago, when he first went into the Ecuadorian embassy to evade extradition to Sweden on charges that have since been dropped to not complicate things. I think for us, this moment of Julian Assange in the Ecuadorian embassy in London was a very very visual and very strong one in terms of it suddenly bringing what was an ongoing fight online on very different levels in very different spaces between the powers that be and internet freedom, anyone fighting for information freedom online or for accountability. This suddenly got a very, very clear kind of visual image of just by the Ecuadorian embassy being surrounded by British police for a number of years. In the beginning, it was surrounded by many police people. I'll just quickly show you the images. Where are we? I am. Quickly, this scroll down. So, this was the situation in autumn 2013. So the Ecuadorian embassy is on your left, like behind number 3. And Julian Assange received or was granted political asylum by Ecuador, but then couldn't leave the Ecuadorian embassy for 6 years. He was forcefully removed from the Ecuadorian embassy in 2019. And for us as artists who at the time were working a lot in London and kind of stumbled upon this place and this kind of the craziness of having a police so forcefully present in front of a foreign embassy in the middle of the city, it kind of led to us asking, what can we as artists kind of bring to this situation? And we spent some hours there looking at the comings and goings and trying to understand what normality was in this situation, trying to think about how we could bring some normality into this situation. And we decided to try to physically kind of go through the police barrier by sending a piece of mail. So in a very mail art tradition, send a letter to the Ecuadorian embassy. Also because, of course, email never was granted the same protections as physical mail was and still is, at least in Europe. We have postal secrecy. It's not, you cannot open somebody else's mail without court order. And so we thought, well, let's test that. Let's see what happens if we send Julian Assange a piece of mail and see, whether this arrives. To know whether it arrives, we then ended up building a whole parcel because we needed kind of the feedback from the journey. And maybe you want to.
Yeah, and kind of like the idea was to how do we get like feedback out of this parcel, and one of the thing was to put a camera inside and a GPS tracker to kind of like have some sort of like feeds of where it's going and how it's approaching. And so we decided to kind of like put a small hole here, and on the back we attached a mobile phone with 3G access, which would take an image every 10 seconds and send it to our website and have some sort of like a live broadcast. And yeah, we addressed it to Julian. We traveled to East London. The Ecuadorian embassy is in West London. Visited Adnan, which is also here in the group, in the chat. And yeah, would just like, drop it at the postal office, not knowing what's going to happen. We had 3 parcels ready to try to reach kind of like Julian in 3 different ways, and started to tweet about it and let WikiLeaks know via an email that something is arriving. So that's basically me standing in line at the post office in Hackney, in East London, and yeah, waiting to kind of like drop off the parcel.
So you get these views of, movement within the postal system, and immediately after handing over the parcel, it disappeared in a red postal bag for hours. We're showing you the best of the work actually produced over 10,000 images, and they're all on, you can find them on our website if you're interested. I think the percentage was like
95% were black.
Were like just like dark images. But you could kind of see this parcel moving. We also had through the telephone a kind of a location point, which, as you know, is not that accurate when you're in buildings. And the parcel, of course, spent a lot of time in buildings. But we would kind of know more or less what where the parcel was at any given moment. We posted this feed online, so it was public, like we saw it when everyone else saw it, and immediately I mean, we weren't sure what people would do with this, but a lot of people were really interested in this journey of this parcel through the postal system, and we received a lot of help from the internet crowds, either explaining to us the significance of images like these, what is happening in this parcel sorting center. There's an amazing amount of people who know a lot about the postal system in the UK who research this. So they, explain to us the colors for the different bags and what was happening. The parcel moved from a sorting center in East London, moved out to the airport, to Heathrow, where at the time all mail was being sorted, and then basically came back into the city. And for us, it was just a way of also talking about distances, kind of online and offline, but also this relationship between offline mail and email, and this police barrier.
One of the most beautiful things was that kind of like our servers started to crash because too many people were watching this live on our website, and like people helped us like while doing the performance at night to set up kind of like secondary and third servers, so we could kind of like distribute the traffic to different kind of like servers, all for free. Yeah, it was kind of like a beautiful experience.
Yeah. This is already the next day, so the parcel has been on the road since midday the day before. It's now early morning, and we kind of realized at this point that through the movement of the parcel, we were on a delivery van, so the movement was very stop and go, and we kind of realized we were approaching the embassy. This was our first glimpse of outside space after actually posting the parcel the day before. It was nearing midday at this point. This looked very much like the area around the Ecuadorian embassy.
And we're just like the van was just like standing basically in front of the Ecuadorian embassy, but it just like took hours and nothing happened. People started to tweet at us saying, "Hey, Bitnik, something needs to happen. Like nobody in our office is working. Can somebody go and check out what's going on?" Stuff like that.
Then here we kind of thought maybe we're being taken, carried into the Ecuadorian embassy. We couldn't be sure. I'm not sure you see a lot on the image, but there's like a wooden floor and a foot that you can just discern. And then again, darkness for hours. And we were like, where are we? Unsure whether we were actually inside the Ecuadorian embassy or not.
And yeah, and then like after a few hours in the afternoon, this image appeared. So it was pitch black for hours. The location, GPS location was just jumping around, kind of like the Ecuadorian embassy, not being like very precise. But so this was an image which just like, was there for one frame and then turned dark again. And we published it on Twitter, and immediately a journalist from Ecuador was writing us that it's obviously the Ecuadorian embassy, and that she was sitting here, and that she kind of like can confirm that we are.
It's the antechamber or the waiting room.
That we are kind of like inside.
And then we got images like these. Is this thing on? Hats. Hello world. What you write when you're learning a new programming language, you try to write hello world onto a screen. Postal art is contagious. Welcome to Ecuador. Justice for Aaron Swartz. So this is Julian Assange now holding up signs to the camera in a performance to in a performance of solidarity with other people in similar situations as his, or part of the struggle. Aaron Swartz was a programmer, young programmer, who is was very crucial to actually the infrastructure on the internet. He is one of the co-inventors of RSS, which we used to protocol we used to use to how do you say see blogs.
It's still used a lot, like
Okay.
for podcast systems and stuff. Just
Yes.
like it's hidden
Okay.
technology.
Okay, just me.
No.
Yeah. And Aaron Swartz had killed himself about 2 weeks before this performance because he was faced with
35 years of
35 years of prison time for having downloaded, I think, the entire JSTOR database through MIT servers at the time. Very tragic story. Free Bradley Manning today, of course, Chelsea Manning, the whistleblower of the Iraq files. Free Nabil Rajab, a Bahrainian human rights activist. Free Anna Carter. Anna Carter, the founder of Pirate Bay, was still in prison in Sweden at the time. The Pirate Bay, you may know, was a search engine for torrents, or it still is, of course. Sorry. Also, Free Jeremy Hammond, one of the main characters at the time, or the most known person of the Anonymous collective that did a lot of actions online. Free Rudolf Elmer. Rudolf Elmer was is a Swiss whistleblower, the first whistleblower of the private banking, or the first private banking leaks whistleblower. These have been added to in recent years with the Panama Papers, but he was actually the first one to kind of leak a lot of documents around private banking. Free Anons. Transparency for the state, privacy for the rest of us. Postal art is contagious. Thank you, Ecuador. Thank you to all our supporters. Keep fighting. 2013, we will win.
Out of cards, yeah, and it's now 10 years later. The appeal for extradition has just finished today, some minutes ago, an hour ago. People are waiting for the verdict. It's not clear if it's coming out today or later. But a person, a dear friend of ours, Tatiana Batticelli, who supposed to be part of this event here, but went to London instead, has sent us a report from London, and maybe we can
quickly share
her kind of like voice, like from some hours ago, explaining what's happening in London and how it feels.
Yeah.
Tatiana Batticelli is the director of the Disruption Network Lab here in Berlin. Did a lot of research on hacktivism, on whistleblowing, and is kind of like an important figure, at least here in our scene.
Here she is.
Yeah.
And I'll just try to play this. Oh, yeah. I hope you can hear this.
Club. Thank you, Mediengruppe Bitnik, to allow me to say my impressions from here in London. Yesterday was a very long day in front of the Royal Court of Justice. We were many people fighting for the freedom of the press and also being there in support of Julian Assange. As we know, today is the second day of the Assange extradition hearing, the extradition to the US. And of course, we are all very worried, angry, and concerned on what is going to happen. Although there are rumors that the verdict won't come today, but in few weeks. We will see what happens. Something important to say is that since yesterday, journalists were not treated how they should have been. Many of them were not allowed to hear properly what was happening. They didn't have enough equipment to write, no tables, no laptops, no possibility to actually have a good connection to report what was going to happen. And many were also left in a gallery that was close to the room of the hearing. I could not hear anything. And today, same situation. From the early morning, even journalists that were close to the people speaking, and they could not hear the US arguments. Today is the day in which, after the Assange defense of yesterday, we will hear what US is going to say. Is the day of the US authorities speaking, but they do not act in the extradition directly. They go through the Crown Prosecution Service, so we will hear from them what is going to happen. And from my perspective, I find that being here is very important, but at the same time is also just crazy to think that this trial is happening. And it's also very worrying in general because it's a trial that is putting the life of a person at stake that could be extradited to the US and spend his rest of his life there. And also is very intimidating for the future of the press, and not only, also for whistleblowers that would like to say something, or for people like us that are working on these subjects. Is a trial that should not happen because doesn't have the fundament it should have. For somebody that is not even a US citizen and is persecuted here in London. So what to say? We really have to be strong here all together, and we should not be intimidated. I think there should be even more people here of what there are, although we are many under the rain, and we should think that we all should imagine in the future to keep speaking and tell the truth, because situations like these are done to silence all. And especially now that we are witnessing a lot of wars around the world, especially in Europe, what Julian did was extremely important. Not only he was able to revolutionize what journalism means, because WikiLeaks was allowing everyone to access data that otherwise were hidden and secret, but also he was giving voice to whistleblowers, to sources, to truth tellers that were, for example, exposing war crimes. So they were denouncing what was happening in Iraq and Afghanistan, like in the case of Chelsea Manning. So I don't know what will happen today, is early to say, but we have to consider this situation as something that will make us fight in the future. We have to fight for Julian, we have to fight for all the people that think what he did was important, and they keep making this job possible, that they go on also fighting for the truth, and also we have to fight for the freedom of speech.
So I remember the video, I mean the camera that was delivered to Julian Assange. I was following that, and I remember all the internet kind of excitement around it as it was happening in real time, and I think, but I suppose the connection with I'd say opera calling and that piece of work is is infiltration and how a kind of a colonial system can be hacked by very small technology and hands-on technology that doesn't cost that much. And I really like that because that's a very kind of emancipatory kind of understanding of how to use the tools of technology as opposed to kind of like high tech distractions. And obviously, so what that does for me is that it breaks down the fetishness around technology and around hierarchies at the same time. And so therefore, and which is kind of what Graham Harwood was doing with Uncomfortable Proximity with the Tate Gallery in 2000. And where, if you remember, that people visited the site, every other few clicks, it will go to images of bits, some of his family, but also decayed images of, say, the working classes at that time with kind of diseases and stuff like that. And I think yours does the same because and I think there's not so much of that happening at the moment. And I think the value of what you're doing is really important because it gives people hope that we haven't got that kind of opaque, kind of monolithic system that just tells us one story, and which is their story. But the story you two created was a little gap through that where you can not only create a kind of spiritual form of liberation where people can actually have access to some kind of playful situationist antic or post-situationist antic, but and I think that's good because what it symbolizes is hope, non-violent hope of hacking that creates a kind of cultural collectivity through that process because people are going through that in real time regarding when you're sending that piece to Julian Assange. So that's the kind of stuff, what it means to me anyway. So
yeah, thanks.
Thanks a lot, Mark.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I mean, it has, I think from our perspective, it has become a lot harder to do these types of actions because technology has become so determined or closed or opaque, as you say. It's kind of one surface and there's like no way in. I feel when we started out, it was much more, there were more players involved, but it was also patchier. So you could see the gaps, you know, we would say, we need to find the cracks where the light comes in, you know, where we can kind of, and that has become harder. So also for us, you know, it's kind of this question of how do we break this belief that the technologies we have are the only option, or like they have to be, you know, it's always kind of, it's a bit like the American dream in a way, like the other side, you know, it's sold to us as the evolution of mankind led to Elon Musk buying Twitter. And you're kind of like, no, no, you know, this kind of, but where does this no have find a place or a kind of I don't know, it's, yeah. I mean, without sounding depressed at all, but it's kind of, I feel what we do are very small gestures, but we do try to actually realize them, put them into the world, and kind of, you know, it's also many times for us, it's a loss of control. We create this situation and then it just kind of takes it on its own life, and we kind of, you know, try to make meaning out of that.
Yeah. Okay. I've got another one that I've written down as well. Sorry. Uh, uh, do you think, just look at my notes here. Do you think that uh, there could be a contemporary version of what you've been doing yourself uh, now? And if you do, or you may even know what that looks like right now, what do you think that is now? Is it because the way you've approached it is kind of like you say, find the cracks and go through. But if that was to, in a way, have a lineage and cut and grow into something now, what do you think that would look like? Whether it's systemic or small scale, what do you think that might look like? If it's reliant on technology or not?
Mm. It's a difficult question. I kind of feel there's there's also some generational gaps that where I'm sometimes not entirely sure how to overcome them. I think at least we are definitely part of a generation that remembers a time before the internet and remembers iterations of the internet and promises of the internet. And this kind of informs our way of thinking also about different technologies or alternative technologies, which I sometimes fear that maybe younger people lack a bit. They're kind of they're like with platforms. So when we teach, young artists usually use Instagram, and then we're like the people that go, oh, but before you upload stuff to Instagram, keep it, like make a copy of it, have your own archive. You cannot rely on Instagram because Instagram is a platform. It's not working for you. They may go offline or whatever, do something else, and you may not like it. So you kind of need to create your own way of narrating your own story or history as an artist. And for them, that is maybe sometimes a bit absurd because there's always been Instagram. But of course, for us, there's been, MySpace and I don't know, Tumblr and whatever else. And it's gone through these generations and I kind of feel that is something that I'm not sure about how to navigate. What I do see is a lot of initiatives, at least in Europe, that are thinking about low tech, not solutions. Solutions is wrong. Low tech networks or different ways of using technologies that are mindful of also environmental issues, for example, that try to find other ways of being together online. And I think that is really interesting, but I do feel we're kind of in an in-between moment, maybe a bit, where I do hope things are gathering, but yeah, maybe, yeah.
Yeah, it's always a problem of scale, of course.
Yeah.
You can have like small ideas, but then how do you translate them kind of like into bigger things? Also, like with protocols, which are kind of like involving now of kind of like building other internets and other forms of kind of like which are not dependent on platforms and stuff. But there, like the problem is always how to kind of like how to grow them. You need to kind of like you need to be able to reach a lot of people, and that's the approach of all the kids also nowadays. They want to be kind of like visible.
Yeah, it reminds me of the Lucky Strike March in America. Was it when was it the 30s or 40s in America when the feminists wanted to have their march shown on television, and what's his name, Edward Bernays, made a deal with them if they could have their march on television, their radical march, if they actually hand over their kind of, well, it didn't hand over anything, but what they did is march of promoting the cigarettes to the, and that got seen on television, and that was, and in a sense, that's what the internet feels like now, and culture feels like now, is that the deal that we've got is that we cannot transcend large scale unless we make the deal with the, I won't say the devil, but unless we make the deal with, in that way, to become something that we're not. And that's the way it seems to me.
Yeah.